rising maritime tensions between the Philippines and China still. Manila condemning Beijing's installation of floating barriers in a part of the Scarborough Shoal.
The Philippines has executed a special operation to remove a floating barrier installed by China in the South China Sea.
The South China Sea has become a cacophony of conflict, not from blasts, but from a floating barrier transforming Scarborough Shoal into Asia's latest flashpoint. Nestled just 120 nautical miles from Luzon, Scarborough Shoal is now a symbolic battleground where geography, livelihood, and national pride clash. Satellite images unveil a Chinese barrier, sealing the lagoon and sidelining Filipino fishermen. This tactic tightens Beijing's grip without a single gunshot fired. The 2016 Hague ruling already sunk China's 9-dash line. Yet Beijing boldly dismisses this international law, reinforcing its claims with stubborn resolve. In 2025, tensions erupted, with clashes between vessels and China's provocative Nature Reserve Declaration, igniting fears of a broader confrontation.
黄岩岛是中国的固有领土，菲律宾派多艘公务船侵闯黄岩岛领海，严重侵犯中方主权和权益，严重破坏海上和平稳定。
While Beijing touts its actions as defensive reactions to provocations, the U.S. warns that gray zone aggression endangers regional stability. Experts argue that China employs slow coercion, facts on the water that steadily erase others' rights. Now, the region finds itself at a crossroads, teetering between escalation and diplomacy. One misstep could ignite a larger crisis. Today, Scarborough Shoal embodies more than just a reef. It stands as a test of sovereignty, alliances, and the ocean's future. The floating barrier has morphed into a potent symbol of power and defiance. The world holds its breath, eager to see who will bend, who will resist, and who will shape the rules of the sea. Scarborough Shoal lies just 120 nautical miles from Zambales, right inside Manila's exclusive economic zone, EEZ. For Filipinos along the Luzon coast, these waters are more than lines on a map. They are part of daily life. They provide food, jobs, identity, and dignity. The shoal is a triangular coral atoll with a calm lagoon inside, a natural haven for local fishermen. Para sa mga mangingisda, ito ang pusod ng kabuhayan. Yet, beyond its clear blue waters, it is a key geopolitical point. Scarborough sits near vital sea lanes that connect the Pacific Ocean to the South China Sea, a route for trillions of dollars in global trade. To military strategists, controlling these waters means controlling oil, goods, power, and security. For China, the shoal represents a key part of its claim over most of the South China Sea. For the Philippines, it tests sovereignty, international law, and national pride. For the United States, it's a pressure point in the larger Indo-Pacific balance. Since the 2012 Scarborough standoff, China has maintained control, using Coast Guard ships and militia to patrol the waters. However, the Philippines has not given up its claim, supported by the 2016 Hague ruling, which rejected China's 9-dash line. Manila asserts that Scarborough is legally part of its EEZ, and that Filipino fishermen should have access. Today, the shoal is a flashpoint where geography meets national identity. It represents strategy and livelihood, where small boats confront superpower ambitions. It is not just a reef. It symbolizes who gets to fish, sail, and set the rules of the sea. On October 8, 2025, the truth came not from a press conference or a leak, but from space. High-resolution satellite photos by Satellogic, shared through Sky-Fi, revealed a huge new obstacle at Scarborough Shoal's lagoon. The satellites captured more than just a structure. They sent a message. The barrier consists of buoys, ropes, and anchor lines, forming a blockade aimed at stopping small fishing boats from accessing the shoal's narrow entrance. For fishermen, especially from Zambales and Pangasinan, this lagoon is a vital safe haven during storms. Now, that refuge is shut tight. This isn't the first blockade. China has put up and taken down similar barriers before, revealing a pattern. Block the Filipinos, watch their response, then pull back under pressure and repeat. Experts describe this strategy as deploy when convenient, remove when criticized. It's part of a broader gray zone campaign to tighten control without sparking open conflict. These moves are aggressive enough to intimidate, but carefully designed to avoid military retaliation. For Filipinos, the satellite images hit hard. For Americans observing the Indo-Pacific, they raised alarms. Critics say for Beijing, the barrier is just another quiet move in a long game, a slow advance across contested waters, masked by terms like administration, protection, and sovereign rights. One question now looms over the West Philippine Sea. If a nation can fence off the sea today, what will be next?
The controversy around Scarborough Shoal isn't just about ships, buoys, or disputed waters. At its core is a battle of laws, rulings, and international norms. And on paper, the Philippines stands on solid legal ground. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, PCA, in The Hague, delivered a landmark ruling that reshaped the legal narrative in the South China Sea. After a 3-year case filed by Manila, the tribunal struck down China's sweeping 9-line claim, declaring it without legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, a treaty both the Philippines and China signed. The ruling went further. It affirmed that Scarborough Shoal lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, EEZ, roughly 120 nautical miles from Luzon. In legal terms, that means one thing. Filipinos have the exclusive right to fish and exploit resources in those waters. Under UNCLOS, the rules are crystal clear. A coastal state's EEZ grants it exclusive sovereign rights over fisheries, natural resources, and economic activities. In other words, within the exclusive economic zone, the Philippines is the only nation legally entitled to harvest, manage, and protect its waters. No foreign power, even a superpower, can unilaterally block access or impose barriers on a coastal state's traditional fishing grounds. And yet, China openly rejects this legal reality. Beijing has dismissed the 2016 ruling as null and void, insisting that it has had historic rights over the shoal for centuries, despite presenting no legal proof recognized by international courts. In Chinese state messaging, Philippine patrols and resupply missions are branded as provocations, while China's deployment of barriers and Coast Guard ships is framed as lawful protection of sovereignty. This is where the clash becomes larger than a reef. For the Philippines and much of the international community, law, not power, should decide ownership and access. For Beijing, power itself becomes the law. And so Scarborough has become more than a maritime dispute. It is now a global test case. Will international law prevail in the 21st century? Or do might and muscle decide who owns the sea? By mid-2025, the West Philippine Sea was already tense, but August turned that tension into a full-blown crisis. On August 11th, a Philippine resupply and escort mission near Scarborough Shoal was suddenly intercepted by both a Chinese destroyer and a China Coast Guard vessel, aggressively maneuvering to block the Filipino ships from entering the area. In the chaos of sharp turns, blaring horns, and dangerously close passes, the two Chinese vessels collided with each other, slamming steel against steel in a miscalculated attempt to corner the Philippine ship. The China Coast Guard cutter's bow was reportedly crushed, and intelligence sources suggested possible Chinese crew casualties, though Beijing immediately downplayed the incident. Meanwhile, the Philippine vessel emerged shaken and heavily battered, a visual reminder of the expanding risks faced by Filipino sailors on what should have been a lawful, routine mission. Instead of stepping back, China escalated further just days later. In a move that stunned Manila and drew sharp attention from Washington, Beijing announced that Scarborough Shoal would be designated a national nature reserve. Chinese state media framed it as an environmental measure, a plan to protect fragile corals and marine life. But for the Philippines, this was no act of conservation. It was a political trap, a legal smokescreen that would allow China to justify blocking Filipino fishermen in waters well inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ. The DFA immediately filed a diplomatic protest, calling the declaration unacceptable, illegitimate, and a violation of international law.
The Philippines, likewise, has the exclusive authority to establish environmental protection areas over its territory and relevant maritime zones.
Washington also voiced concern, warning that unilateral changes in the shoal undermine regional stability. As images of the battered Filipino vessel spread online, public anger surged at home. Fishermen repeated the same plea they voiced for years. Hayan yo kaming mangisda sa sariling dagat. In response, the Philippine government delivered its most defiant tone yet. The Department of Foreign Affairs demanded that China respect Philippine sovereignty and comply with international law, reminding the world that the 2016 Hague ruling had already invalidated China's sweeping claims. President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr., standing firm in front of cameras, issued a line that would echo from Manila Bay to Washington, D.C. We will never surrender even 1 square inch of our territory. With a collision at sea, a nature reserve declaration from Beijing, and a fiery vow from Malacañang, the pattern of escalation in 2025 became undeniable. What began as fishing ground harassment had evolved into a dangerous geopolitical showdown, navies, and possibly the United States under the Mutual Defense Treaty. Scarborough Shoal was no longer just a disputed reef. It had become a powder keg, and every buoy, ship, and barrier placed upon it was another spark waiting to ignite. On its surface, the barrier at Scarborough Shoal is more than a rope and buoy system. To Beijing, it's a defensive response wrapped in words of reason, restraint, and supposedly rightful authority. According to the Beijing-based think tank South China Sea Strategic Situation Probing Initiative, the barrier is justified as a reaction to what China frames as provocations from the Philippines and outside forces. In a recent piece, SCSPI's analysts argued that Filipino actions, resupply missions, Philippine fishing boats entering waters China claims, and increased U.S. involvement have forced China's hand. In SCSPI's version of events, China did not initiate aggression. Instead, it responded to repeated intrusions and challenges within what it claims to be its maritime domain. As one SCSPI official put it, China acts as an anchor of peace and stability in the region, providing marine public goods like patrols, disaster relief, and law enforcement, so long as others respect its waters. Beijing also emphasizes its view that within waters it claims, including those around Scarborough Shoal, it has the inherent right to act, monitor, restrict access, and enforce management. This position rests on a nationalist narrative of historic usage, combined with maritime security logic. One article by SCSPI stated that freedom of navigation operations by the US and its allies are in fact the real threat to regional order, and China's moves are framed as protecting sovereignty rather than disrupting it. The tone thus shifts the story, from one of unilateral blockade to one of reactive defense. China's public messaging claims it is being patient and reasonable. It says it is responding to others' actions rather than launching them. The barrier, under this narrative, isn't an escalation. It's a measured step, a necessary measure to safeguard what China views as its rightful seas. In its official voice, China didn't close the shoal to shut out Filipinos. It locked the gate because others were trying to sneak in. Yet beneath that language of restraint lies a critical question. When does defensive behavior become coercive interference? And when does responding to provocation become the provocation itself?
The standoff at Scarborough Shoal is no longer just a local quarrel between Manila and Beijing. It has become a litmus test for American credibility and the future of international norms at sea. At the heart of this is the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, a pact that obligates both nations to come to each other's aid if either is attacked. With tensions rising, diplomats, analysts, and ordinary Filipinos now ask the same question. If Beijing crosses a line, will Washington step in? The MDT has suddenly gone from a quiet legal document to a potential tripwire, forcing the U.S. to weigh its red lines and responsibilities in the Indo-Pacific. For Washington, Scarborough is about more than protecting a longtime ally. It's about deterring a precedent that powerful states can change borders and rewrite maritime rights by force or intimidation. U.S. officials have repeatedly stated that an armed attack on Philippine ships, aircraft,
or public vessels in the South China Sea would invoke the treaty. A warning meant to keep China's actions below the threshold of open conflict. But America's challenge is sharp. How do you stop aggression that is designed to look like not quite war? This is the strategic trap of the gray zone. Across the globe, historians and security experts are drawing parallels between China's gray zone warfare and Russia's territorial plays in Crimea and Ukraine. Moves that gradually changed realities on the ground without formal declarations of war. In the South China Sea, analysts describe a creeping form of maritime imperialism, where barriers, Coast Guard ships, swarming militias, and legal narratives slowly erode the rights of smaller nations. No bullets, no missiles, just quiet, constant pressure. Each step small enough to avoid triggering military escalation, yet bold enough to accumulate real territorial control. To Western policymakers, this is the new battlefield of the 21st century. Territory taken without invasion, sovereignty eroded without war, and international rules bent by those strong enough to ignore them. That's why nations from Japan to Australia, and institutions from NATO to the EU have expressed concern. They know that if the rules collapse at Scarborough, then no small nation's sovereign rights in Asia, Europe, or anywhere else are truly safe. And so, the world watches a shoal barely visible on most maps, not because of its size, but because of what it represents. Will laws and alliances still matter, or will power alone decide who owns the sea?
To understand China's moves at Scarborough Shoal, experts say you have to step back and study the pattern, not the individual incidents. In testimony before the U.S. Senate, maritime security analyst Ray Powell warned that China has already scored imperial successes in the maritime domain. Not through open warfare, but through non-military coercion that changes realities at sea one step at a time. Powell argues that Beijing has perfected a strategy of incremental control, installing floating barriers, deploying Coast Guard ships and militia swarms, declaring administrative nature reserves, and then waiting for the world to move on. Each action may seem small or temporary, but together, they slowly shrink the space where other countries can exercise their rights. Analysts call this approach a campaign of facts on the water, to create a new reality first, then defend it later as if it were always there. This same playbook has appeared across the South China Sea, from Whitsun Reef, where hundreds of Chinese vessels swarmed and anchored to show presence, to Second Thomas Shoal, where water cannon harassment and blockades have attempted to choke off Philippine resupply missions. The pattern is unmistakable. Close access, normalize control, then deny that anything changed. No missiles, no invasions, just constant pressure, backed by ships, paperwork, and propaganda. Security experts say this is the genius and danger of China's maritime strategy. It avoids a war the US could respond to, but still erodes Philippine rights bit by bit, like waves wearing down rock. By the time the world reacts, Beijing has already moved to the next step. Powell and other strategists now warn that the Scarborough Barrier is not an isolated incident. It is the latest chapter in a long, methodical campaign to dominate the West Philippine Sea without firing a single shot. The crisis at Scarborough Shoal now stands at a crossroads, and the next steps taken by both Manila and Beijing could determine whether the West Philippine Sea drifts toward dangerous confrontation or hard-won diplomacy. China's trajectory appears clear. Analysts believe Beijing will likely expand floating barriers, increase Coast Guard and militia patrols, and deepen the so-called nature reserve system to make its control look permanent and lawful. The strategy is to wrap coercion in the language of protection, while normalizing Chinese authority at the shoal day by day, patrol by patrol, buoy by buoy. If left uncontested, Scarborough could quietly transform into another fortified outpost in Beijing's maritime network. For the Philippines, the path is narrower but not hopeless. Manila can continue issuing diplomatic protests and leverage the 2016 Hague ruling to reinforce its moral and legal standing under UNCLOS. At the same time, expanding defense cooperation with the United States, Japan, and other like-minded partners offers a counterweight to China's pressure. Closer alliances, more joint patrols, and stronger maritime domain awareness could help ensure that the Philippines is not isolated at sea or at the negotiating table. Yet Manila must walk a tightrope,
assert its rights without triggering a miscalculation that could spiral into open conflict. The stakes extend far beyond one shoal on one map. Scarborough has become a symbolic battlefield for the entire Indo-Pacific, a test case that asks a defining question of our era. Can smaller coastal nations still enforce their sovereign rights against a great power's creeping expansion? If the answer is no, then the precedent will echo, not only across the South China Sea, but across every contested waterway where force threatens to overshadow international law. If the answer is yes, then Scarborough could one day stand as proof that persistence, alliances, and rule-based norms can hold back even the strongest tide. For now, the world watches, waiting to see which path the region chooses: escalation fueled by power or diplomacy anchored in law.
In the end, the floating barrier in Scarborough Shoal is far more than a line of buoys drifting on salt water. It is a symbol of sovereignty challenged, of a nation's pride tested, and of the fragile limits of international law. Each cable stretched across that lagoon tightens an invisible rope around the rules-based order that has long governed the world's oceans. And each satellite photo, collision, and standoff silently marks another round in a drawn-out struggle for control of the Indo-Pacific. Scarborough has become the stage where one small nation insists on its rightful place in its own waters, while a powerful neighbor seeks to redraw maritime reality through steady, unrelenting pressure. It is also the arena where the United States and the international community must decide how far they are willing to go to defend principles they claim to uphold: freedom of navigation, respect for UNCLOS, and the protection of smaller states from coercion. What hangs in the balance is larger than one shoal. This standoff may define the next chapter of US-China-Philippine relations, and with it, the future of maritime order across the region. Will the seas of tomorrow be ruled by law or simply by the largest fleet? For now, a floating barrier sits on the waves, a quiet challenge, a warning, and a question the world has not yet answered. If you liked the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.